When I was young, I spent a considerable amount of time on my grandparents' farm in South Georgia. This is a photograph of their old farmhouse, years after it had been abandoned. My grandparents' 40-acre farm was located in a rural community known as Greeno. My father and his two brothers bought the farm for their parents following World War II. Prior to that time, my grandfather had been a sharecropper. His sons gave him the gift of farming his own land. Some of my fondest memories were made at this old house. For one thing, I remember sitting with my grandparents in our great big rocking chairs on the front porch at night, watching the fireflies dance about the yard. We'd be sitting and rocking while listening to the Grand Ole Opry on the radio through the open window, and I'd be drinking a mint julep tea. In the middle of the night, I'd wake up to hear the soulful wail of a distant train crossing through the piney woods on the far side of midnight. You could set your clock by the train's lonely whistle. Come summer, we'd be eating ice-cold watermelon on the hottest days, out behind the farmhouse. And come winter, we'd spend cold nights bundled up inside a house that had precious little heat and absolutely no insulation. On the coldest nights, my grandmother would heat bricks in the wood-burning stove and place them in our beds just before we turned in. My grandfather taught me to shoot from the front porch of this old house. He taught me a lot more than just how to shoot, though. A lot of my education involved these incredible tractor rides that he would take me on to the distant corners of the farm and beyond, with him teaching me things he thought important along the way. Interestingly, a lot of his teachings involved animal lore, with a little farming thrown in for good measure. I saw my grandfather do things that now puzzle me, like call up animals from the forest and talk to the wasps before carefully removing their nests by hand from the eaves of the house. I'll never forget what my grandfather taught me. Much of it informs my life today. My grandfather died in 1962 at the VA hospital in Dublin, Georgia. He was in and out of the hospital all the time I knew him, the result of injuries suffered in France during the First World War. He had served with the 42nd Infantry. While in France, he rode an Indian motorcycle up and down the front lines, delivering messages. When he came home from the war, the first thing he did was to buy an Indian motorcycle like the one he had in France. He used it to court my grandmother. When my grandfather was home on the farm and feeling well, he was a real dynamo. I watched him stand on his head just to win a bet a few days before he went to Dublin for an operation that should have been fairly routine, but which he didn't survive. He was a great storyteller and a legendary shooter. And he was a bit of a clown, too. I have this other old photo showing my grandparents. My grandfather's clowning around. My grandmother was not a happy camper. A traveling photographer had come to the farm, and my grandmother wanted a nice photo of she and my granddad. But he didn't want to pose for a photo. But she insisted. She told him to go inside the house to change out of his overalls, and this is how he returned to be photographed. He's wearing the loudest shirt and shorts imaginable. I never saw him in shorts, and I'm amazed that he even owned a pair. A few weeks ago, I saw my grandfather in a dream. I don't recall having ever dreamed of him before. How I would enjoy talking to him again, if only I could. In the dream, he was there, and yet he wasn't. There were no words spoken between us, just a silent acknowledgement that we were family. I suppose some families are like that. Not long after my grandfather died, my grandmother left the farm for good. By the time I returned to photograph the farmhouse in 1976, it had fallen into disrepair and was being used by a new owner to store hay. I suspect the house is gone now, but my memories of it still remain. I can see it clearly in my mind.